Many of the most famous encounters with unknown aircraft in the sky rely on taking the word of witnesses to prove what they say they saw really happened. Sometimes we might be provided with photos or videos of the incident. Something a little more tangible that, while never perfect, is evidence of some sort that independent people can view and interpret to get an idea about what was said to have happened. But one of the most rare and possibly convincing forms of evidence is anything physical, as you might expect. This is where there is something tangible that is actually left behind. Something that leaves the witnesses with one of the more strongest forms of proof available that there really was something out of the ordinary that they came across. Sometimes this is as simple as scorch marks on the earth and possible remnants of thrusters or engines propelling the ships. Other times it can be fragments of material that have no earthly business being where they are found. These are some of the more compelling things to be left behind because there's something that physically can be touched, seen, smelled, or possibly even tasted if you're weird enough. Something that can be examined and evaluated by others. Real proof that can be touched and felt. But what about the other forms of physical evidence? What about those whose encounters have led them to they themselves bearing some mark or some proof on their body of what they went through? What about strange blisters, hair loss, this episode is sponsored by Keeps, or other irrefutable physical ailments that came around in the aftermath of what is, on the face of at least, a fairly incredible tale of a close brush with alien life? Join us today as we look into what has become known as the Vickie Landrum UFO incident. Welcome to Texas, United States of America, the Lone Star State. With a population of over 30 million people as of 2024, it has a long and storied history, almost becoming its own nation way back in the day. Famous, well, I think it actually was until it joined the United States. Famous for sports teams like the San Antonio Spurs, the Dallas Cowboys, and others, if you can call the Dallas Cowboys famous. It is the state that Mark Cuban, Beyonce, and Matthew McConaughey all call home, as well as being the birthplace of historical folk heroes like Davy Crockett. But when it comes to all things supernatural and possibly alien, it would also be fair to say that it has its own fair share of stories. Just before the turn of the 20th century in 1897, there was a UFO that allegedly crashed on a farm near Aurora, Texas. The reports at the time claimed that there was an alien piloting it, although he or it didn't survive the landing. The remains of this alleged alien were buried in the local cemetery. Naturally, this caused a level of intrigue and attention because we just buried an alien, as well as a hefty dose of skepticism that wouldn't be surpassed until the even more famous Roswell incident nearly half a century after. But both of these are other stories for another time, maybe a video all of their own. What we are looking at today became known as the Vickie Landrum incident, and we're moving to much more recent history, only going as far back as 1980 to find out what that's about. On the 29th of December 1980, a car was traveling through East Texas with 51-year-old Betty Cash accompanied by 57-year-old Vickie Landrum and her 7-year-old grandson, Colby Landrum. The trio were returning home from dinner to Dayton, Texas. They were driving along a road to the north of Houston near Piney Woods when something strange appeared above the trees in front of them. They soon spotted a strange light above the tree line as it traveled along a quiet road and initially presumed that it was just an aircraft making its descent towards some nearby airport. After driving a little further through the woods, they spotted the light again, although this time it was much brighter and much clearer. They would describe it as being a diamond shape, and they stated that there was an immense heat that came off of it. Hot enough that it made the bodywork of the car hot to the touch. Vickie Landrum claimed that the metal on the car had taken in so much heat that when she tried to get back inside, she had to protect her hand with part of her clothing to stop herself from being badly burned. She would also state that the dashboard of the car had softened under this extreme heat, so much so that she left a handprint on it when she touched it. On that, she would claim, was still visible multiple weeks after the fact. They would estimate that the size of the unknown craft was somewhere between the region of about 100 feet, and it seemed to hover above the treetops. This fire and heat that was being produced by it became even more intense as it brought itself lower down towards the ground. Both women exited out of the vehicle to get a better look, and they considered trying to turn the car around and then head back the way that they had come just to get away, but decided against that idea because what is self-preservation, and since they were confident that they'd be able to accomplish this maneuver successfully should they need to. In addition, Colby, the 7-year-old grandchild who had stayed in the car, was scared for his grandmother to get back inside of the vehicle, so she actually did so to reassure him. Betty Cash stayed outside a little longer to observe the craft. They would also report that there was a strange intermittent light that came from the craft as it came towards the ground and then would become clear. It appeared to hover just above the trees, seemingly controlling its height with intermittent blasts from the thrusters at the bottom of the craft, which were responsible for much of the heat. Over the course of multiple minutes, the craft stayed in the same place, moving slightly up and down, letting the car's occupants get a clear look at it. More descriptions that they offered after the fact were that it was a metallic silver color and somewhat resembled a water tower with top and bottom half cut off. Eventually it rose back above the trees and into the sky. And this was when the witnesses reported that a large number of helicopters appeared and surrounded the unknown craft. They counted 23 helicopters in total and stated that they surrounded the unknown aircraft before Cash and Landrums drove on, still glimpsing both the craft and the helicopters through the gaps in the trees as they traveled. They would report what they had seen, and it wasn't long before their story captured the imagination of many who had heard it. But Betty Cash and the Landrums would soon have a more pressing matter to worry about than just the odd confrontation with an unknown flying object. In the immediate aftermath of their encounter, all three of them claimed that they began to suffer various forms of physical illness and afflictions, probably what we would call radiation exposure. The night of the encounter, they had all reported degrees of vomiting and diarrhea, as well as having painful warmth to their skin that they described as being similar to a sunburn. Sounds a lot like radiation. They also claimed to have pain in the eyes and an overall sense of feeling weak, all of which they attributed to their encounter. But it was Betty Cash, who was 51 at the time, that seemed to suffer the worst of whatever was causing them issues. She would develop blisters on her body that would end up being taken to the emergency room, well, not her blisters, but her entirely, on the 3rd of January, 1981, 5 days after the encounter. She was struggling to walk and had begun to suffer from hair loss. Despite being kept under medical care for just under 2 weeks, she was then released, but she did not get much better and soon required a second hospital stay of just over 2 more weeks. According to her own account, she claimed that she was initially treated for burns that had caused her blisters and skin damage, but the doctors changed their diagnosis to radiation sickness and began to believe that she had been exposed to high amounts of it. Vickie and Kobe would initially recover fairly quickly from the illness that followed the encounter, but in April the next year, Vickie started to need treatment for a cataract that was developing in one of her eyes. 2 years after this, in 1983, Betty would develop breast cancer, and there was a question, at least in the minds of these women, not only about what it is that they had encountered that day, but whether it was having some long-term effects on their health. In the aftermath of the incident, the two women would seek legal advice and would end up suing the U.S. federal government to the tune of $20 million. While there was extensive evidence gathering carried out, and not only the women, but also multiple members of different agencies were interviewed at length as part of the process, the case would end up being dismissed on the 21st of August 1986, nearly 6 years after the initial event and 5 years after the legal process had been started. As well as this legal case, there was multiple investigations that were carried out. After the event, the pair had contacted multiple agencies in order to tell them about what they had experienced, and they were met with varying degrees of disbelief. So what do we really think happened to them? As this case has persisted in the intervening years, with the usual mix of reactions that are based almost entirely on personal beliefs of the people looking at it, as always, there are those that are skeptical about both this incident and others like it, and will be naturally more likely to focus in on kind of what's perceived to be weaknesses or flaws in the account, and then use this to generally discredit the whole story. Given the rather extreme physical effects that were suffered by the witnesses in this case, it would seem unlikely that the entirety of everything would have been a hoax. However, this is always a possibility that does need to be considered. The question that needs to be asked, however, would be what were they likely to gain from such a story? Notoriety, perhaps, fame, maybe even a little, but for this entire story to be in its completeness made up, we need to assume that both of these women involved somehow inflicted their fairly serious physical injuries on purpose just to substantiate their claim. Exactly how they would give themselves recurring blisters and hair loss as well as physical weakness so extreme that it required hospitalization to treat is not really one that stands up to scrutiny. Not to mention, the man in charge of the only formal investigation into the incident by the government, Lieutenant Colonel George Sarin, seemed fairly convinced that not only were Cash and Landrum both credible witnesses, a police officer and his wife, who attested to seeing multiple helicopters in the same area on the same night, were also reliable, and he believed they were telling the truth. Many who are skeptical about at least some aspects of the story have pointed out some inconsistencies when it comes to the physical aspects that were reported. Now, we need to be perfectly clear here. There is no one insinuating that Betty did not develop breast cancer or that Vickie did not start having issues with cataracts, and the hair loss that Betty reported does appear to be documented in her medical notes. Some do point to the fact that this hair loss was not mentioned or reported in any of the medical notes from her initial hospital visit, and while it was recognized and noted by a doctor at a later date, it was attributed to the condition known as alopecia. There are also questions over whether radiation poisoning would result in symptoms and issues that were reported, or more precisely that the dose of radiation that basically would cause these extreme conditions and reactions in such a short amount of time would probably be so high that it would kill the recipient. It has also been pointed out that there was little to no knowledge of the overall health of the two women prior to the incident, and it would therefore be difficult to allocate every ailment or disease that followed their encounter to it. While people exposed to high doses of radiation do suffer far higher rates of cancer than the general population, it does tend to be over like a long time scale, because if you're exposed to a lot of radiation really quickly, it basically degrades your DNA to the point you just die. So if the dose is high enough to cause immediate physical issues, it is usually fatal. In a slightly more generous interpretation, some have suggested that all the health problems that the two faced in the aftermath of the incident may not be related to it, but that the victims truly believe that two are associated. One, that there is no malice or ill intent, but that they were affected by the incident to such a degree that they essentially blamed it for anything that physically went wrong with them, especially in the immediate aftermath, which is not as ridiculous as a suggestion as it might appear on the surface. In fact, some investigators went to the site after the fact with Geiger counters in order to measure for any above normal levels of radiation and didn't find any either at the location itself or in the car that the trio were traveling in. One investigator suggested that what the trio thought they had seen had been, in fact, a sort of optical illusion or mirage that was based around the brightest star in the southern constellation of Carina, known as Canopus, which I'm fairly certain Canopus. Yeah, it's one of those. So it's not really clear exactly how this would explain the heat and the other aspects of the sighting, or indeed the clear shape of the craft as described at that time. And the final explanation, of course, is that they did see something completely otherworldly, something beyond explanation. The swift arrival of the Air Force helicopters, as attested to another pair of witnesses, would seem to imply that not only is the government aware of what it truly was, but they had moved quickly to deal with it and then denied it ever happened in the aftermath. But before we move on to what the most likely explanation is, it is always worthwhile to kind of compare the Vickie Landrum incident to any others that bear similarities. While encounters with unknown objects and potential visitors from outer space are relatively rare, possibly not happening at all, but also possibly happening all the time, we just don't know, at least as the general public, there have been several notable other similar instances over the years that are all well worth kind of diving into if this has been of interest to you. One of UK's most famous cases, actually, that we have previously described occurred in the Rendlesham Forest. The Rendlesham Forest incident, actually I did a video on this, and this became known as Britain's Roswell, and this occurred in December of 1980. This was an event that would probably require you to kind of go look at that video to check it out, which you should do. It's on this channel. But the basic gist of it is not too far from a Royal Air Force base called Woodbridge. A security patrol from that base would see multiple lights falling from the sky and then landing in the nearby Rendlesham Forest. They would then enter the forest in order to get a closer look at whatever had landed there, presuming at that time that maybe it could have been an aircraft and somebody had been downed and was injured, but instead they claimed to have seen a glowing metal object covered in lights of various colors. Although it was reported when authorities went back to investigate there were no signs of this aircraft, and instead there were just indents in the ground that could have been indicators of where it had landed. They would then take radiation readings of the alleged landing site 2 days later and find them higher than expected. While they were doing this testing, they witnessed another unexplained light, this time red in color, flashing across the sky to the east. It remains one of UK's most divisive UFO tales, with skeptics explaining it away in any way that they can, and believers holding it up as the gold standard for solid proof of extraterrestrial life. And arguably the most famous location in the whole world when it comes to these things, aliens and UFOs and everything else, that's gonna be Roswell, New Mexico. Because USA, baby. Back in 1947, reports surfaced of an unidentified flying object, not that unusual in and of itself, but this one actually crash landed in the desert near Roswell. It also should be noted our technology significantly got better. I'm not saying, we'll talk about that in a minute. So while the official version of events pins this strange sighting, subsequent crash landings, and the relative secrecy that was kept about the entire thing on the fact that it was part of a secret operation that was developing novel aircraft for army use, not everyone was convinced. Many believe that the sightings of the flying disc in the area around the same time were civilians that had spotted an alien craft flying low over the desert, and that the US Army had moved quickly to secure the site and then acquire debris. Not because it was any sort of clandestine operation, but because they had finally gotten their hands on not only alien technology but life forms themselves. The Roswell incident became immortalized in TV and books and further afield as it became the poster child for those who truly believed that there was something else out there beyond what we were told. And the case for all of it just being a top secret weather balloon that was made harder to prove as bit by bit people would emerge from the woodwork and bolstered the alternative theories. Men who claimed to have worked in the area for the government at that time, bearing tales of live aliens being recovered and experimented on. It wouldn't be until the 1990s that any full information about Project Mogul was released by the US government, the program that had stated the balloon, that's where it was from, and by that time, the alternative narrative had only grown in popularity and plausibility. But eventually, fully coming clean nearly half a decade after the original event, the government had not put themselves in the strongest position for believability, which they never do. I mean, what do you guys feel like? Do you trust the government explicitly? So the entire Roswell incident is one that we may look into kind of more depth at a later point, but it's something that needs a video to really fully appreciate it, and because, I don't know, hopefully you guys enjoy these. But we have also previously covered some other incidents that bear a lot of similarities in this channel, with the Phoenix Lights, the story of the alleged secret underground alien base hidden out in the desert, as well as the story of the lost cosmonauts. Again, you can find all these on this channel if you have any interest. So when it comes to the Vickie Landrum incident, the question, as always, is where do we stand on what seems to be the most plausible answer? Well, if you're a frequent viewer, then you will have heard this disclaimer many times before, but as always, I mean, it's up to you. Honestly, until there's 100% proof, there's really no way to go about it. But regardless of others and what they say and think, the best option is always to look for evidence yourself, evaluate how you feel about it, and then draw your own conclusions, whichever one you are happy with and makes the most amount of sense to you. On the face of it, it's easy to see why it captured the imagination of the public so intently, especially those who believe the ideas of extraterrestrial life. After all, having physical, actual proof is always the gold standard, and while the health troubles that were endured by the two women, especially in the aftermath, is truly saddening, there is no denying that the added angle concerning their issues does add to the story. And for what it's worth, despite the failed lawsuits and the various investigations that all found them to be credible, both Betty and Vickie would live on following their encounter. Betty would die on the 29th of December 1998, exactly 18 years to the day after their encounter at the age of 69. Vickie would die on September 12, 2007 at the age of 83, having lived almost 27 years beyond whatever happened to them that day. And if you look long enough, you can certainly find opinions that vary widely about what exactly happened in East Texas that night. Some believe that they truly encountered something out of this world, and that the failed lawsuit investigations were nothing more than a cover-up by the US Air Force, trying to deny the presence of their Chinook helicopters and their knowledge of whatever was in the sky that day. Some point to the injuries as being caused by the incident, and others believe they simply attribute them to kind of just other explanations to serve just as well. A few sources claim that the symptoms were either exaggerated, faked, or otherwise embellished. Whether this was an attempt to gain more attention for their story, to get some more money out of the government, is really hard to say. But again, it goes without saying that this is a very big accusation for people to make, and not one that should be made lightly. Whatever you choose to believe, it's fairly easy to understand why this incident has remained so well known to this day. So there you have it, the event that came to be known as the Vickie Landrum incident. And now we get to the point where I kind of ramble off some ideas here, kind of off script a little bit, because it's just what I like to do. So here you have somebody who obviously was dealing with radiation sickness to a degree, because radiation sickness causes blisters. How it works is there's two forms of radiation sickness, right? Well, there's not two forms of radiation sickness. The degradation of your DNA is ultimately what causes the issue, but there's two ways to get radiation sickness. There's indirect radiation sickness, and then there's direct radiation sickness. So indirect radiation sickness is essentially when radiation passes through the water, actually in your cytoplasm and the nuclear envelope, and it'll heat up this water, which then can kind of destabilize your DNA, causing breaks in the actual genetic backbone, which can cause issues if your DNA polymerase comes over and is like, ooh, that shouldn't be like that, and then it can't really fix the genes, in which case it'll have to do a gene deletion, which if you do like a gene deletion in the P51 gene or the tumor suppression gene, not exactly ideal because you can get cancer later. So that is indirect, but direct is essentially when you actually have a charged particle run into the DNA itself, and it can cause a lot of damage, instant gene deletion, that sort of stuff. All of this can basically cause your cells to, over time, either just straight up enter apoptosis because they can no longer function with the amount of genetic damage that they have, or it could be something as simple as, over time, your cells get defunct earlier and earlier. You have something that is known as the Hayflick limit, which says your cells can divide about 40 to 60 times before they reach that limit of how far they can go. And once it's typically done because your genetic damage will increase over time, making the cell non-viable. So if we take possible radiation damage in and of itself, we have to try to figure out what sort of radiation is being released. So you have alpha, beta, and gamma. So alpha particles, if I'm remembering this correctly, can be stopped with a sheet of paper. Beta particles, you need like solid lead to stop them. And gamma, you need like concrete lead, basically everything. It's a whole thing. So if for some particular reason you were in the car and only alpha particles were being emitted, you'd actually be safe in the car. Now, there still would be heat, but the alpha particles couldn't pass through the glass and they couldn't pass through the metal. So the 7-year-old and Vickie would actually have been protected from alpha particles. Because Betty stayed outside of the car longer looking at the thing, she was exposed to more alpha particles. Now, alpha particles also, I believe I'm remembering this correctly, they stop mostly at the skin, but they can go a little deeper from time to time. So that would actually cause blisters, and it would actually damage the hair follicles and the cells associated with those, because those are on the surface, which could cause hair loss, and those could cause blisters. Now, the other thing to remember is when you get what is basically sunburn is damage to your genes, right? So when you're out in the sun, the UV radiation will actually strike your genetic coding and create these things called thymine dimers, which is damage to your body. So essentially the area gets flushed with blood because your body's trying to repair, and then when your skin starts peeling off, that's your skin choosing to die so it does not give you cancer. So if they were being treated for sunburns, then you have the issue of, okay, I've been exposed, my skin has been burnt, my genetic coding has been messed up. Another thing to also note is UV radiation can cause cataracts. Now, when you get older, when you're in your 50s, you're likely to develop cataracts anyways because you've been outside a lot. But it's important to remember that the more exposure you have to UV radiation, the quicker cataracts can form. I find it interesting because for a woman to end up dropping at 69 years old, it's not unheard of. Obviously, you don't know, she developed cancer, which is a big thing, but it's kind of more strange. I usually have a longer lifespan, but typically around this age, you live to be around, what is it, like the average lifespan is 74, that's like 76 for males and females. So it's interesting that she did drop. So if everything did turn out the way it did, that could help to explain what was really going on. She was exposed to low levels of radiation, possibly only alpha particles. Now, the question also is the helicopters that went around it, or did it even happen? So it's not really that crazy of a thing. Like everybody's always like, there's two camps, right? Some people think that the government will just deny things that happen and it's just par for the course. That's me. I think the government denies things all the time because they kind of have to. Because who's asking the questions, right? Let's say you're developing this crazy spaceship type of deal and you have a citizen asking, well, did you develop that? You can't just outright be like, yeah, we developed it, because it could be a Chinese nationalist who also wants to know if you're developing that thing, or it could be any other country who wants to know if you're developing that thing. So really, you can't just tell the public what you're doing. So I get it like from that perspective. So it's not really, to think that the government wouldn't hide what they're working on is a little naive, I believe. But if they were working on it, we are now 30 years past Roswell. If something did crash there, and if they were able to recover technology from that thing, which again, as I just stated, it is important to understand how much our technology has increased since just the 50s. You're talking orders of magnitude higher now. And it almost feels like it came out of nowhere. It seems like we did this jump in technology, and it seems a little wild. Now, obviously that could just be naturally homegrown intellect of humanity, in which case, hell yeah. But if it's not, then possibly if we did steal technology, it could help to explain why that is the case. And it also would help to explain why we would build something as busted as barely able to hover above the trees and releases a ton of radiation, whereas maybe aliens had already perfected the technology. I mean, this kind of goes hand in hand with what we've seen recently, where there were UAPs, I believe they changed the name after the fact from UFOs, that was breaking the sound barrier without creating a sonic boom. That's absolutely wild. Nobody knows. Well, we don't know, but I'm sure somebody knows where that came from. So the point is that, did she lie about it? Did she not? If there's medical documentation that shows that night somebody got a sunburn, which, believe it or not, it's really hard to get a sunburn at night. The moon doesn't, usually give you sunburns. And as far as I know, there's nothing called a moonburn. Then that would be pretty strange. Of course, there's really no telling. It could have been a lie, but the medical issues they had after the fact, the blisters that formed, the hair loss, because even when you get a sunburn, you don't really get hair loss. That kind of indicates there's some sort of radiation a little deeper. Now, again, alpha particles aren't as bad as the other particles, but even still, it can create problems. But ultimately, what do I believe? I think that it is possible that there is technology that our government has, that other governments have, that we just simply don't know about, because there's really no need for us to know about it, because if we know about it, we're gonna talk about it on Twitter or something, and then another country's gonna be like, oh, sick, you guys have that? Cool. So I think that it's probably in the government's best interest if they have some sort of technology that they're working on to not tell everybody under the sun, even if they get sued. And even then, it's a blacklisted, completely confidential project that's not going to be brought up in a court system. It's just not a possibility. So they may have actually seen what they saw, but it may have been human replicated or alien replicated technology based on human builds, so to speak. But anyhow, I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments. Was it a human build or was it an alien build, or were they just lying? I mean, it's really hard to tell. I do want to thank my patrons real quick. At the Literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson West, Michigan Dogman, Monkey Man, Stupid Fox. At the Eyewitness to the Event tier, we have Beaver Malaga and Dragon Master Knight. The first-hand accounts tier, we have Yeeps, and at the second-hand accounts tier, we have Bianca, Fred Rush, Stutz, Troy, and to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping out, so thank you. All right, that's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.